Tonight's program with Dr. Dikran Kaligian and myself, The State of Denial, Manufacturing a Scholarly Controversy, Denying a Genocide, is of course a standalone event, but it's also in part a preview of a larger event that will take place in October of this year. That will be a conference entitled Manufacturing Denial and the Assault on Scholarship and Truth, co-sponsored and organized by Clark University's Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Kaligian Mugar Chair in Armenian Genocide Studies at the Strassler Center, the Armenian Genocide Program at Rutgers University, Worcester State University, and NAASR. This will be, to the best of my knowledge, the first time scholars from the social sciences and scholars from the natural sciences will come together to examine the phenomenon of denial and its various forms. The focus of this conference will be on the ways in which scholarship and the academy function as a primary battleground in a struggle that resonates far beyond academia, and a major goal is to stimulate a dialogue across disciplines, since increasingly, it seems, in recent decades, the subversion of scholarship to generate a bogus debate to serve political or corporate ideological purposes is part of the way we live now, to borrow a phrase. But on to tonight. First, some thanks. This talk draws on material from several essays published in the Armenian Weekly April magazines, the current issue of which was just hand-delivered tonight by editor Richard Hovannisian, and which features, among other excellent pieces, by the way, the article by Steve Kirkjian that is the basis of Steve's talk that he gave here a couple of weeks ago. So please do pick them up. They're free. They're up in front, and if we run out, we'll get more. So thank you to Kachik for all of his support. And I've benefited greatly from the suggestions of many, many friends and colleagues with whom I've discussed this topic over the past decade or more, including, but not limited to, George Akjayan, Taner Akjan, Aram Arkun, Peter Balakian, Kevork Bardakjan, Michael Bobelian, Ted Bogosian, Levan Torbajian, Bedros Dermatosian, Jennifer Dixon, Ida Arbal, Dalida Hadjian, Richard Hovannisian, Dikran Kaligian, Kachik Muradian, James Russell, Arasanjan, George Sherinian, Roger Smith, Henry Terrier, Keith Wattenpaugh, and perhaps most of all Luann Matosian, whose ideas and mostly unpublished research I've benefited from immensely. And my purpose in listing all of these people is not merely to engage in name dropping, but to underscore that this is an issue that engages in different ways and to different degrees a wide range of people who take it very seriously. So, on December 17, 2013, the European Court of Human Rights found that a 2007 Swiss conviction of right-wing Turkish political figure Doğu Perinçek under Switzerland's anti-racism laws for denying the Armenian Genocide was a violation of freedom of expression. The court said that Perinçek, quote, had never questioned the massacres and deportations perpetrated during the years in question, unquote, only the legal characterization of those events as genocide. The court thus appeared to find subtle legal arguments in Perinçek's statement that the Armenian Genocide was, quote, an international lie. The court doubted that there could be a general consensus as to events such as those in issue here, given that historical research was by definition open to discussion and a matter of debate. In so doing, the ECHR clearly distinguished the present case from those concerning the negation of the crimes of the Holocaust, which had been found by an international court to be clearly established. Now, we must set aside questions about the efficacy of genocide denial laws, which form the basis of this case in the first place. What's significant for our purposes is that the court's decision appears to be a crowning achievement of the ongoing effort to attach permanently the words controversial or debatable to the phrase Armenian Genocide. We must briefly address the question, what is denial? On a very simplistic level, denial is merely the negation of a fact. There was no Armenian Genocide. Global temperatures are not rising. There's no proof of evolution. Smoking doesn't cause cancer. However, denial is seldom so total or so unsophisticated, and the norm, certainly for what we will call academic denial, is to deny while appearing only to question. Indeed, just as genocide is understood by some, including Raphael Lemkin, as a kind of radical, perverse act of creation, so too denial does not aim merely at a negation of reality, but at creating a new reality. One recalls a now famous 2002 article by writer Ron Suskind, in which he reported a conversation with an unnamed aide to President George W. Bush. Dismissively referring to Suskind as part of what we call the reality-based community, the aide explained that when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too, and that's how things will sort out. It's in the same spirit, I think, that denial of the Armenian Genocide functions. I have elsewhere, in one of the Armenian Weekly articles, drawn a parallel to Jorge Luis Borges' uncanny masterpiece, Tlon Ukbar Orbis Tertius, in which an invented world, outlined in encyclopedic detail and complexity, gradually begins to force its way into the reality-based world, and to disintegrate, with the day in sight, as the story concludes, when imaginary Tlon will become the reality of this world. We needn't look too far to find the insights of Borges' nightmarish fiction manifested in the growing area of academic denial, where, to an alarming extent, we're already living in Tlon. How does it happen then, nearly a century after the Armenian Genocide, and in the midst of decades of growth of the scholarship on this genocide, that a manufactured controversy is able to provide cover for an august international court to legitimize genocide denial? So I'd like to give a brief overview of the development of academic denial of the Armenian Genocide, some of its analogs or influences in the realm of science denial, and examine a few recent representative examples before handing the program over to Dikran. Denial of the Armenian Genocide began concurrently with the Armenian Genocide. It was a part of the Committee of Union and Progress's execution of the Armenian Genocide. As the Ottoman Armenian population was massacred and deported, the Ottoman leadership constructed a narrative that, subjected to periodic revisions and refinements, remains in place today. Armenians were disloyal and rebellious. They had bombs and guns. A threat to security they were, and the war effort. It was therefore necessary to temporarily relocate them, and measures would be taken to protect them and safeguard their property and assets. Each element of this narrative, and each measure taken to give it substance, was a fabrication, but what was important was that each part of it could be made to appear true. The fabrications were institutionalized in Turkey by Mustafa Kemal as the official narrative of denial about the Armenians. Despite Kemal's comment in 1920, made famous by Taner Akcan, that what was done to the Armenians was, quote, a shameful act. More tellingly, in a 1923 speech he declared, Armenians acted as if they were the owners of this country. Without a doubt, there couldn't be greater injustice and audacity than this. Armenians have no rights in this prosperous country. The country is yours. It belongs to the Turks. This country belonged to the Turks throughout history, thus it is the land of the Turks, and it will belong to the Turks forever. Would become the basis of the official history of Turkey and the place, or no place, of the Armenians in it. This official history has long been and continues to be maintained, augmented, and adjusted by the semi-official Turkish Historical Society. However, manufacturing a fake history for domestic consumption is a different matter than exporting it to foreign markets, such as the United States, where the genocide had been heavily reported in the press and public sentiment had been aroused to assist survivors. However, there was a realization in Turkish circles as early as the 1920s and 30s that American public opinion mattered enough to invest in trying to change it. The most famous manifestation of this was Turkey's successful effort in the 1930s, working hand in glove with the US State Department, to pressure Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and indeed the entire Hollywood establishment to quash the planned production of a film adaptation of Franz Werfel's best-selling novel about the Armenian Genocide, The 40 Days of Musadag. Another part of our story originates in America's tobacco industry, starting in the 1950s. Unable simply to ignore or suppress evidence of the deadliness of their product, Big Tobacco set out to place the link between cigarettes and cancer under a perpetual cloud of doubt, a strategy that worked for decades and provided a template for numerous similar efforts. Eventually, Turkey and those who support its official narrative took a page from the playbook of Big Tobacco and developed a strategy seeking to establish a permanent historical controversy over what happened in 1915. Historian Robert Proctor has summarized the tobacco strategy as turning the entire public sphere into a spectacular arena of deception, with two sides to every story and cigarettes presumed innocent until proven guilty, with the bars for proof set so high that no one could ever get over it. In 1972, the vice president of the industry-run Tobacco Institute described the strategy of creating doubt about the health charge without actually denying it. In a 2002 memo, Republican strategist Frank Luntz advised that the scientific debate on global warming, quote, is closing but not yet closed. There is still a window of opportunity to challenge the science. You need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. In strikingly similar terms, in 2011, Taner Akcan related that he had been informed that around 2004 or 2005, a US-based academic had counseled Turkey's Ministry of Foreign Affairs that little could be gained anymore by trying to confront the Armenian Genocide issue directly, and that the thing you need to do, in Taner's words, is to dig a ditch in front of all the genocide claims. You need to create doubt by writing scholarly works, which will awaken that doubt. And the ditch diggers have not been idle. A Potemkin village, or a Potemkin academy of denialist scholarship has been built, meant to convey the impression of a robust scholarly debate and to lay claim to academic credibility, while always seeking to forestall any conclusions being drawn, or any consequences arising from such conclusions. In many instances, this form of denial coexists comfortably alongside more traditional modes, such as blaming Armenians for their own destruction and rationalizing support for Turkey's conduct on the basis of political expediency. Armenian genocide denial emerged in American universities during the Cold War. Bent on, quote, dissipating the heavy cloud that blotted the reputation of the Turkish nation, unquote, in the words of Richard Hovannisian. A cadre of academics in Turkish and Ottoman Studies ignored, minimized, or denied the Armenian Genocide, a formative event in the shaping of modern Turkey. There isn't time tonight to chronicle in detail the development of Turkish and Ottoman studies in the United States. However, a key figure in the post-World War II era was undoubtedly Lewis V. Thomas, who, between 1949 and his death in 1965, trained the first generation of American specialists on the Ottoman Empire. As such, Thomas's 1951 work, The United States and Turkey, stands as an important benchmark. Thomas does not deny the eradication of the Armenians. However, he writes, quote, the Armenian sufferings do not cancel out the fact that many of them were potential rebels against the state, even if, as he generously allows, only some of them merited this title. Ultimately, he employs the realpolitik coup de grace. Had Turkification and Muslimization not been accelerated there by the use of force, there certainly would not exist today a Turkish republic, a republic owing its strength and stability in no small measure to the homogeneity of its population, a state which is now a valued associate of the United States. Nearly coinciding with the publication of Thomas's work was what in many ways stands as the ur-text of Turkish denialist scholarship. Esat Uras's book, which was published decades later in English as The Armenians in History and the Armenian Question. Uras, born Ahmed Esat, was an important figure in the Ottoman administration during the time of the genocide and was heavily involved in its planning and execution as a high official in the Directorate for Public Security. Uras's book established, albeit in crude form, many of the fundamental tropes of denialist scholarship that have remained in place for decades. Also around the same time, coincidentally, beginning in the early 50s, American tobacco giants began their efforts to create a doubt around the alleged link between smoking and cancer, which in many respects provided a paradigm for their other large-scale efforts to deny unpleasant truths, including modern denial of the Armenian Genocide. Big Tobacco's strategy when it was confronted with mounting scientific evidence of the direct tie between smoking and lung cancer was devised by the PR firm Hill and Knowlton. In the words of cancer researcher Deborah Davis, this plan, quote, can be summed up very simply: create doubt. Be prepared to buy the best expertise available, to insist that more research is needed before conclusions can be reached. The tobacco industry would marshal its own experts to magnify the appearance of scientific debate long after the science was in fact unequivocal. John Hill's brilliant innovation remains a staple for those who would fight the conclusions of science even today. And for science, I think we can also read history. A key component of this plan was the creation of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, later called the Council for Tobacco Research. Hill himself suggested that the word research appear in the name, presumably to bolster the appearance of scientific objectivity. Proctor notes that for decades, it was the world's leading sponsor of what appeared to be tobacco and health research. However, the goal was really to look in such a way as not to find, and then to claim that despite the many millions spent on smoking and health, no proof of harms had ever been uncovered. In early 1954, an ad appeared in the New York Times and more than 400 other newspapers over the names of the heads of most of the major cigarette manufacturers and tobacco growers, entitled, without apparent irony, a frank statement to cigarette smokers. Admitting that recent reports, quote, have given wide publicity to a theory that cigarette smoking is in some way linked with lung cancer in human beings, the statement cautioned that the recent findings are not regarded as conclusive in the field of cancer research, and eminent doctors and research scientists have publicly questioned the claimed significance of these experiments. Decades of manufactured controversy were thus set in motion. Through a combination of its influence as a major American industry and the credibility by association generated by funding research at institutions of higher learning, Proctor writes that the industry was able to clog congressional hearings, distort popular understanding, and delay or weaken legislation designed to regulate smoking. Tobacco charlatans gained a voice before the U.S. Congress and were often able to insinuate themselves into peer-reviewed literature. In 1969, a tobacco executive, exhibiting the kind of candor for which we may now be grateful, wrote that, quote, doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy. We have to be grateful for, among other things, the fact that these many lawsuits that took place in the 1990s mostly brought into the public view literally millions of documents which allow us to see what was going on behind the closed boardroom doors. We don't have that kind of evidence for those studying denial of the Armenian Genocide. Perhaps we never will, I don't know. In their study, Merchants of Doubt, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway show that the tobacco strategy has been deployed to create politically motivated, bogus controversies around such scientific phenomena as acid rain, the depletion of the ozone layer, and global warming, among others. They write, respected media outlets repeated these claims as if they were a side in a scientific debate. Then the claims are repeated again and again, as in an echo chamber, by a wide range of people involved in public debate. In all of this, journalists and the public never understood that these were not scientific debates, but misinformation, part of a larger pattern that began with tobacco. The creation of academic denial that purports to be engaging in honest inquiry by exploring both sides of a dispute has had the same effect in both the natural sciences and social sciences. The debate itself becomes a key structural component of any discussion of the subject. The Turkish state and its apologists did not learn denial from the American tobacco industry or from American public relations firms. But by the late 1970s, early 1980s, with both activism and scholarship on the Armenian Genocide expanding, altered conditions required new methods, and some of these new methods were old hat for Turkey's PR advisors. We should recall that by 1970 or so, there was still virtually no Western scholarship on the Armenian Genocide. Armenian studies as a field in the US was still in its infancy, and writings on modern Armenian history, including the genocide, were minimal. The development of a body of scholarship on the Armenian Genocide in American academia can largely be traced to the post-1965 efforts of Richard Hovannisian and his students at UCLA into Vahak and Dadrian. Armenian American activism to publicize, memorialize, and gain official recognition on the state and national levels for the genocide also began to increase substantially in the same period and met with some success. In 1975, Turkey began working with the firm Manning, Selvage and Lee, quote, for the purpose of influencing the attitude of the public and the Congress toward Turkey. In the following years, other firms would be added, most importantly, Gray and Company and Hill and Knowlton. Hill and Knowlton was one of the largest and most influential public relations firms in the world, with considerable expertise in precisely the kind of narrative reframing Turkey needed and which it would pursue with increasing vigor following the appointment of Shukru Elekdağ as ambassador to the U.S. in 1980. You've probably seen that. Speros Vrionis has written of the impact of the profuse and organized public relations and propaganda output during Alec Dodd's tenure as ambassador, and in particular his inauguration of a new policy in the vast world of American academia. The public relations push was multifaceted. An immediate need was to become more effective in countering Armenian American efforts to secure U.S. recognition of the genocide, and here the expertise and connections of Turkey's new PR and lobbying partners would prove invaluable in defeating congressional resolutions, most dramatically in 1990, as well as preventing any recurrence of a sitting president publicly uttering the words Armenian Genocide. Of particular interest to Turkey was its presentation in textbooks, reference works, and in scholarly writings. Just as tobacco companies understood that children are potential future customers, Turkey realized the value of exposing students to their version of history. Such an effort would be facilitated by having work at hand by credentialed Western scholars presenting a version of history sympathetic to Turkey's official narrative. Thus, the key element of Turkey's long-range strategy was to expand upon the small group of American scholars producing work that emphasized, in a positive sense, Turkey's role in the world. By funding and encouraging further scholarship, it would be possible to cultivate academics to produce a body of Turkey-friendly, and in some cases, genocide-denying scholarship. The strategy was imported from Big Tobacco. As Proctor puts it, quote, fund lots of scholarship to dispute a hazard, then cite this research to say that lots of scholars dispute it. Directly inspired by, or simply parallel to, Big Tobacco, Turkey created its own version of the Council for Tobacco Research, the Institute of Turkish Studies, directed by Ottoman scholar Heath Loward, to boost its scholarly bona fides. Established in 1982 through an initial grant of $3 million from the Turkish government, ITS served a similar function to the Tobacco Institute, generating prestige by association and dispersing funds to scholars and universities, including, one should note, many entirely legitimate scholars and projects. Vrionis, as well as most vividly Roger Smith, Eric Markison, and Robert Lifton, have shown that ITS also directly served the interests of the Turkish embassy. The Turkish ambassador serves as honorary chairman of its board of governors. And breaking with Turkey's official line carried with it serious consequences, as the late Ottomanist Donald Quater would learn in 2008 when he was forced out as chairman after writing a book review that acknowledged the Armenian Genocide, after a long career in which he had rather explicitly avoided doing so, and called attention to the heavy aura of self-censorship among Ottoman scholars. In 1985, ITS Director Heath Lowry crafted Turkey's version of Big Tobacco's frank statement, a 1985 advertisement formally taken out by the Assembly of Turkish American Associations in the New York Times and Washington Post, urging the U.S. Congress not to pass a resolution recognizing the genocide as such, with the names of 69 scholars who questioned the appropriateness of using the word genocide to refer to the Armenian suffering during the World War. And you can see some snippets of it up there. The key point being that the weight of evidence so far uncovered points in the direction of intercommunal warfare. Much more remains to be discovered before historians will be able to sort out precisely responsibility between warring and innocent, and to identify the causes for the events. This statement was used for years in order to prove the existence of a scholarly debate, and as a tool in Turkey's efforts to prevent any further measures to recognize the genocide in the U.S. But by the year 2000, Alec Dodd would complain that, quote, unfortunately this document cannot be used effectively now, and that ITS had lost its function and its effectiveness, which suggests that he conceived its function to be rather more than just funding scholarly research. Instead, he urged the creation of, quote, a project to make it quite clear that Turkey is not at all afraid to confront the realities of its past, a project aimed at shedding light on the historical facts, unquote. It may be that with its increased influence in the world, the Turkish state wanted more than simply to get its way by asserting its will. It wanted its narrative to be believed and legitimized. Genocide denial needed to be made respected. Since that time, the Turkish state and those who support it have ratcheted up their efforts, in many ways replicating, but also refining and expanding the methods of the 1980s, as scholar Jennifer Dixon has documented. In 2009, with the creation of the Turkish Studies Project at the University of Utah, funded not by Turkish government money, but by the Turkish Coalition of America, which, as its name suggests, is of course a US-based group, It was appropriate that Shukru Elekdag was on its advisory board, since the effort could itself be seen as the fulfillment of his vision of an almost Nietzschean transmutation of values vis-a-vis the Armenian Genocide. The Utah Project, under the direction of Professor Hakan Yavuz of the Department of Political Science in the Middle East Center, has been singularly productive, issuing books and organizing numerous conferences on various topics in late Ottoman history, with special care taken to cultivate the debate between what Professor Yavuz terms, quote, competing epistemic communities on the Armenian issue. Utah had established itself as a denialist beachhead prior to the establishment of the Turkish Studies Project, with the publication in 2005 of Günter Louis' The Armenian Massacres in Ottoman Turkey, a Disputed Genocide. The book's publication in Utah was arranged by Yavuz, and it is fitting that Yavuz and Elekdag would be alongside Louis when, in 2005, he was honored by the leader of the Turkish parliament shortly after the book appeared. Louis gives the impression of an agnostic who is ready to believe if only he can be shown sufficient evidence. But alas, no authentic documentary evidence exists to prove the culpability of the central government of Turkey in the massacre of 1915-16. Writes Louis. Building on rhetorical strategies rehearsed in the 1970s and 80s by Gwyn Dyer and Michael Gunter, Louis presents himself as the ideal figure to cast an impartial eye on this disputed genocide, assuming the Orientalist view that Turks and Armenians are fundamentally incapable of writing their own history, and proclaiming that, quote, unlike most of those who have written on the subject of the Armenian massacres and who are partisans of one side or the other, I have no special axe to grind. In Louis' version of history, no one could have foreseen that the orderly and humane process of relocation, as described in some Ottoman documents, would all go so badly, except that so many people did. Germans, Turks, Americans, British, pretty much anyone who saw what was happening, and many people did, and they wrote about it. But Louis discards their first-hand impressions and eyewitness accounts as being no proof of governmental intent to exterminate, since after all, we have as a counterbalance genuine Ottoman documents stating that the temporary relocation was to be carried out in a benevolent fashion, with the deportees fed, cared for, and their property and assets protected. Like Lewis Thomas, Louis stops just short of saying that Armenians deserved the harsh treatment they received. However, quote, not surprisingly, he writes, the Turks eventually came to consider the Armenians a fifth column and decided to take decisive measures to put an end to these treasonable actions. Although none of this can serve to justify what the Turks did to the Armenians, he writes, and this caveat comes with the predictable addendum, Armenians can hardly claim that they suffered for no reason at all. And he writes, while the Armenians were victims, not all of them were innocent victims. And the disaster that overtook them, therefore, was not entirely unprovoked. Louis' rhetoric shows substantial continuities with Thomas, in that while stopping, as I say, just short of saying that the Armenians deserved what they got, quote, as the Turks thought, the Armenian people the world over had thrown in their lot with the Allied cause and were arrayed with them in a fateful struggle. And therefore, not surprisingly, the Turks eventually came to consider them to be disloyal. The significance of Louis' book is not that it broke new ground in the disputed historiography. Indeed, there is very little in it that could be called new. The significance of the book was that it bore the imprimatur of an American university press, thus conveying a certain level of instant credibility and ensuring that it would find a home in university and other libraries. The contra-genocide thesis thus had a new text that could be and would be cited ad infinitum as the other side of the debate. Louis' work arrived at a propitious moment. Articles providing a foretaste of the book appeared in fall 2005, just before a lawsuit was filed in Massachusetts by the Assembly of Turkish American Associations, claiming censorship because of the Department of Education's decision to exclude genocide-denying resources from its genocide curriculum guide. I'm sure many of you remember that case. The basis of the lawsuit, in the words of then President of the ATAA, Gunay Evench, was, quote, protecting public school access to scholarly sources pertaining to a legitimate historical controversy for educational purposes, unquote. The failure of the Massachusetts case, which there's no time to repeat here in detail, pointed, among other things, the need for more convincing looking materials promoting the legitimate historical controversy. The Turkish Coalition of America, formed in 2007 with $30 million from Turkish-American businessman Yalçın Ayaslı, has made the Historical Controversy Project a major focus, funding publications and the Utah Turkish Studies Project, and energetically repeating the existence of a scholarly debate. A section of the TCA website declares, the Ottoman-Armenian tragedy is a genuine historic controversy. Many reputable scholars challenge the conventional one-sided anti-Turkish narrative and or refrain from alleging the crime of genocide. The text continues that the notion of the one-sided Armenian narrative is settled history, does not reflect the truth, and must be utterly rejected. Excerpts from the writings of some 34 scholars are provided. Most do indeed, explicitly or implicitly, deny the applicability of the word genocide. Some do not use the word, but actually provide accounts that are entirely consistent with genocide. Some provide accounts of events that even the Turkish Foreign Ministry would blush to sign its name to. And then there are some other oddities about the list, which I don't want to get into right now, but maybe we can discuss later. The TCA deployed its list of legitimate scholarly resources in its unsuccessful 2010 lawsuit against the University of Minnesota and its Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. The suit alleged defamation and violation of free speech and due process because the center listed TCA among other unreliable sources on genocide. A key aspect of TCA's argument was, in effect, how can we be an unreliable resource when we have a list of credible scholars who support our position? Even though the Massachusetts and Minnesota lawsuits failed, they nonetheless contributed to the idea that the subject of the Armenian genocide is inherently controversial and in dispute, if not radioactive, thus helping to root the discussion in the controversy itself. Another TCA-funded academic publication is Michael Gunter's Armenian History and the Question of Genocide, published by Palgrave Macmillan. That is to say, the TCA's 2010 annual report informs us that it provided unspecified support for what it calls Michael Gunter's politicization of the Armenian genocide claims to be published soon by Palgrave. No such support is acknowledged in the book itself. Gunter helpfully states that his book, quote, presents the Turkish position regarding the Armenian claims of genocide during World War I and the continuing debate over this issue. He cautions readers that, quote, given the received wisdom on the Turkish-Armenian issue, some will argue this book is a Turkish apology. But he boldly exclaims, it is not! Although Gunter offers such gestures towards balance, as stating that I see the truth to lie somewhere between the diametrically opposed positions of the two antagonists, in fact, his statement of intent to present the Turkish position is an accurate reflection of the book's content. The book is not an analysis of what he calls the Turkish position, but effectively an endorsement of it, and a condemnation of the Armenian position. As he writes on the first page of the text, I illustrate that although genocide is a useful concept to describe such evil events as the Jewish Holocaust in World War II and Rwanda in the 1990s, the term has also been overused, misused, and therefore trivialized by many different groups seeking to demonize their antagonists and win sympathetic approbation for them. I include the Armenians in this category because although as many as 600,000 of them died during World War I, it was neither a premeditated policy perpetrated by the Ottoman Turkish government nor an event unilaterally implemented without cause. That is repeated verbatim on page 119 of the book. And it seems to possess such an incantatory power that much of it also appears in the laudatory jacket blurb by Professor Hakan Yavuz of the University of Utah, who writes, the author illustrates that although genocide can be a useful concept, the term has also been overused, misused, and therefore trivialized by many different groups, including the Armenians, seeking to demonize their antagonists and win sympathetic approbation for themselves. Indeed, most of Yavuz's encomium consists of phrases that appear verbatim or nearly verbatim in Gunter's foreword. An extraordinary case of synchronicity, perhaps. Jungians, please take note. As with Louis, Gunter would have it that there have been two sides to the question. This means Gunter acknowledges that Armenians suffered a great disaster, but, quote, the Armenian claim that they were victims of a premeditated and unprovoked genocide does not ring true. In fact, the Armenians were something less than wholly innocent victims, a point which Gunter takes care to make in those or similar words at least 10 times in the book. Thus, each writer shifts at least partial blame onto the victims themselves, and in the process create a new criterion for the victims of genocide, the need to be wholly innocent. In an article published in a peer-reviewed journal, Middle East Critique, guest edited by Hakan Yavuz, Former Utah graduate student Tal Buenos gives this rhetorical turn a new twist, justifying the extermination of the Armenians in Hobbesian terms. Quote, "The Ottoman Empire, caught in a situation of conflict and that threatened its continued existence as such, followed Hobbes's law of nature and acted to remove this threat in an effort to increase its own chances of survival. Even if the fashion in which it acted to remove this threat is disagreeable and condemnable, Hobbesian logic permits any type of action when sincerely battling for survival." Sincerity, it seems, covers a multitude of sins. Using Hobbes to critique Lemkin, while of course making no mention of Lemkin's knowledge of the Armenians and their importance to his conception of genocide, Buenos formulates a new concept, genovive, based on Hobbesian terminology. Under this framework, any action taken by a nation conceived of as being necessary for its preservation would exempt it from the crime of genocide, which is not to say that Buenos allows for any possibility that the Ottoman Empire could have committed genocide. Quote, "The attempts to label the catastrophe of World War I as genocide should abate. If it truly were genocide, the Turks would have admitted it a long time ago, as did the German nation following World War II. QED. This is in a peer-reviewed journal. In a jointly authored article published in Turkey's daily Zaman newspaper, Yavuz and Buenos express the same ideas more succinctly. It is not only the intent of the assailants that is of significance in the scholarly endeavor to better understand the definition of genocide, but also that of its victims, It should be asked, were the victims honorable citizens, or did they become victims after clear efforts to rebel and challenge a sovereign? As Oreskes and Conway wrote of the tobacco industry, quote, "They convinced people who didn't know otherwise that there was still a lot of doubt about the whole matter. The industry had realized that you can create the impression of controversy simply by asking questions, even if you actually know the answers and they don't help your cause. And so the industry began to transmogrify emerging scientific consensus into raging scientific debate." Oreskes and Conway also explore the role of the press in perpetuating the idea of debate. Throughout the 50s and well into the 60s, newspapers and magazines presented the smoking issue as a great debate rather than a scientific problem in which evidence was rapidly accumulating. A clear picture was coming into focus, and the trajectory of knowledge was clearly against tobacco's safety. Balance was interpreted, it seems, as giving equal weight to both sides, rather than giving accurate weight to both sides. So too, we can observe the conscious or unconscious adoption of denialist rhetorical framing by academics and mainstream journalists. The he said, she said treatment of the Armenian Genocide, an approach that is congenial to the historical debate advocates, has become the most frequent fallback position for many mainstream news media, particularly when the writer has no background in the subject matter. The effort to get influential mainstream publications such as the Boston Globe and New York Times to stop mandating inane formulations such as Armenians claim, Turks claim, met with success despite the deeply entrenched tendency to engage in false equivalences and in the belief that this demonstrates a lack of bias and demonstrates journalistic integrity. NYU journalism professor Jay Rosen writes, "Journalists associate the middle with truth when there may be no reason to. Writing the news so that it lands somewhere near the halfway point between the best and worst that might be said about someone is not a truth-telling impulse at all, but a refuge-seeking one, and it's possible that this ritual will distort any given story." And then I'm going to skip a section here on the press. Bringing things back full circle, more or less, and leading to a conclusion. Part of the Orwellian project of denial, not merely denial of the Armenian Genocide, but denial in general, is to reverse the charges, so to speak. That is, the victims were the aggressors. Those who stand against denial and distortion of facts are enemies of truth and are purveyors of hate and violence. Just as scientists who write about global warming are painted to be extremists, possibly, or if not probably, socialists, and certainly un-American. Big Tobacco made substantial efforts to tar, as it were, its opponents. A 1969 campaign called spectacularly Project Truth had among its objectives to expose the criminal libel against the cigarette, quote, "to unveil the insidious pattern of attack against the American free enterprise system, to prove that the cigarette had been brought to trial by lynch law engineered and fostered by uninformed and irresponsible people and organizations in order to induce and incite fear. Proctor writes, the companies must have tired of being accused of bias and decided they could flip this back against the anti-tobacco folks. A great deal of effort went into insinuating that while tobacco finance researchers were striving for objectivity, groups like the American Cancer Society and the National Cancer Institute were mired in self-aggrandizing zealotry and prejudice. Open controversy was a key pillar in the industry's conspiracy. The companies played this card artfully, identifying closure as closed-mindedness and tantamount to anti-science. This was very clever rhetoric, and many scientists seem to have bought it. Sociologist and pro-cigarette advocate Peter L. Berger would even declare in 1977 that anti-smoking is the new anti-Semitism. Consequently, it isn't surprising to find that the past president of the Assembly of Turkish American Associations, Ergun Pirli-Kovala, has written that, quote, Turks are the new Jews, genocide crowds are the new KKK. Facts, figures no longer matter to these lynch mobs. He declares that to Armenians, April 24th, 1915 was genocide. How hollow, meaningless, and unjustified. To Turks, it represents defending your home against domestic terrorist cells, sort of like an Ottoman Guantanamo. The TCA's Turkish American Legal Defense Fund, in an amicus brief filed in the Massachusetts lawsuit, in the same vein, stated that the decision not to include denialist materials in the curriculum guide was, quote, the electronic equivalent of book burning, and that Turkish Americans in Massachusetts live under the apprehension that to disagree openly with the Armenian American orthodoxy on the genocide controversy is to invite not only rancor, but also violence. Theirs is a first cousin fear to the general dread of blacks during Jim Crow to question segregation or white supremacy. Academics tend not to take such an inflammatory tone, but the basic tropes are similar. Proctor writes that tobacco could appear to embrace scholarly inquiry by identifying closure as closed-mindedness and tantamount to anti-science. Similarly, Yavuz writes, frequently those who question the application of the term genocide to the events of 1915 are labeled as deniers, and they are silenced or delegitimized as a result of this weighty stigma, rendering the framework of genocide a conversation stopper. Insisting that the events of 1915 should be tagged the Armenian Genocide rather than massacres and deportations or religious civil war not only leads to dichotomous historiography, but also removes any possibility of shared space in which to understand what happened. The concept of genocide does not help to build bridges. One is reminded of, well, let's see if this is going to work.
In controversy, we're joined by our own media analyst, Rob Corddry. Rob, thanks very much for joining us.
Good evening, John, and thank you for joining us on Rob Corddry's The Fallout.
Rob, critics called this Nightline episode politically motivated, but I watched it. It was really just a very dignified recitation of the names and faces of those that had died.
Well, John, you put your finger on a major problem. How does one report facts in an unbiased way when the facts themselves are biased?
I'm sorry, Rob, did you say the facts? The facts are biased?
That's right, John. From the names of our fallen soldiers to the gradual withdrawal of our allies to the growing insurgency, it's become all too clear that facts in Iraq have an anti-Bush agenda. John, what's missing is a sense of the larger context of the war. That's an issue I'll be tackling tonight on Rob Corddry's The Context.
You get the idea. Scholars who write about the Armenian Genocide per se then engage in a form of censorship and prevent any so-called reconciliation by the very act of employing such terms as genocide and denial. We can perceive the logical conclusion of this. Only those who reject the application of genocide to the events of 1915 can be said to be objective and fair-minded. In light of this, obviously, the term denial itself cannot apply, since it is inherently biased as a concept, even if it is accurate. Henry Theriault has observed, Armenian outrage at the genocide is represented not as a reasonable and understandable reaction to a horrific act of violence, but rather itself as a primary cause of contemporary tensions between Turks and Armenians. Unquote. Thus, not only are Armenians blamed for causing their own destruction in Ottoman Turkey, as we've seen, they and others who talk and write about the genocide are faulted for not building bridges by acquiescing to its denial. One would like to conclude on a note that addresses the ever-difficult question of what is to be done. To use a cliche, the first step is acknowledging that there is a problem, and realizing that the efforts partially described in this paper have had a cumulative effect, that denial can work. That if, for example, it can convince people that such a fact such as global warming is controversial, it can undercut the presentation of the Armenian Genocide within academia. And that academic denial is a key element in a larger project, inasmuch as it gives politically or ideologically motivated actions a desirable air of respectability. Unlike Holocaust denial, denial of the Armenian Genocide has a powerful government and wealthy and well-connected activists abroad, including in the US, to advocate and promote it. In order to succeed, however, it needs legitimate scholars to function as the other side in the debate. You have to hear the finger quotes. Furthermore, since deniers also try to present the subject as a debate between the Turkish side and the Armenian side, when in reality there is the scholarly consensus and the Turkish state narrative, reaching out to Armenian scholars in order to be able to say that both sides are represented has great value. To that end, an invaluable commodity are possibly naive and most likely well-intentioned scholars who often unwittingly have supplied deniers with what they crave most: interlocutors, legitimacy, and a debate. But when the purpose of the debate is merely to have a debate, it's a heads I win, tails you lose proposition for denial. It's difficult to phrase the dilemma better than an Amazon.com reviewer of the book Evolution versus Creationism. Quote, debating creationists on the topic of evolution is rather like trying to play chess with a pigeon. It knocks the pieces over, craps on the board, and flies back to its flock to claim victory. And yet, scholars must confront denial, even though it is time-consuming, frustrating, and on some levels insulting to one's intelligence. Theriault has written that, quote, as we enter the 21st century, denial is becoming the inevitable future of genocide. This is true for numerous particular genocides, including the Holocaust, unquote. Within the field of Armenian genocide studies, one can point to a relatively small but important list of exemplary works as examples of writings by serious scholars that rise to the challenge posed by academic denial. But such rigorous works, which take the phenomenon of denial seriously without granting the deniers the unwarranted status of scholars engaged in a legitimate debate, are rare, too rare. But as time goes on and more denial qua scholarship is published, the need to stand for truth in history will only increase, as will, I believe, the value in seeing commonalities with others in various disciplines who work against denial in its many forms. So I would like now to turn things over to Dikran Kaligian, and thank you for...
I've titled this talk, Anatomy of Denial, Manipulating Sources and Manufacturing a Rebellion. And I'm going to pick up pretty much where Marc has given an introduction to the phenomenon of denial, and then talk about a specific example or a specific part of the argument that's made by deniers, and then try to tear it apart as well as possible. The past several years has seen an increasing number of publications touching on different aspects of the deportation and extermination of the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire starting in 1915. A large portion of these attempt to show that there was no premeditated genocide planned by the Ottoman government or its ruling party, the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP. One of the key arguments made by genocide deniers is that the deportations and whatever unfortunate excesses that occurred during them were not part of a plan of extermination, but rather a response to an Armenian rebellion in the eastern provinces in collaboration with Russia. They go to great lengths to try to show that those instances, such as in Van, where the Armenian population took up arms against Ottoman troops or paramilitary units that had already committed massacres in neighboring regions, these were not isolated attempts at self-defense, but part of a general rebellion. To find the author of such a plan of rebellion, the Turkish government and those academics taking part in the denial campaign turned to the only Armenian political party that was organized throughout the Ottoman Empire, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the ARF or Taşnaksuçu. The crux of this argument is that the ARF led an Armenian conspiracy with Russia to create a fifth column behind Ottoman lines consisting of guerrilla attacks and revolts in Armenian towns and cities. In addition, there was a mass movement of Ottoman Armenians across the border into Russia, where the ARF formed them into volunteer regiments that led the Russian invasion of the empire. To properly analyze these claims, it is imperative to look at the actual deliberations and actions of the ARF in the summer and fall of 1914. The ARF Eighth World Congress, the highest assembly of the party, was held in the eastern provincial capital city of Erzurum starting in July. It had to be adjourned early because of the outbreak of war in Europe. Therefore, it did not have time to come to a resolution on some of the pressing issues. It did decide to direct ARF bodies to do all that was necessary to convince the CUP not to join the war, because such a step would be ruinous, not just for the Armenian people, but also for the Ottoman government. It also passed a provisional resolution concerning terms of military service, which presumed that Armenian citizens of the Ottoman Empire had an obligation to defend the country. Now, what happened after this meeting adjourned has been a source of disagreement in the historiography. In the years after World War I, Armenian sources wrote that after the World Congress was adjourned, a committee of 9 was formed to stay behind to complete certain essential tasks that the Congress had been unable to. While the committee was meeting, Dr. Behadin Shakir and Naji Bey arrived as representatives of the CUP and the government and met for 3 days with key figures Rostom, Agnuni, and Varamyan. Decades of historiography since then, including Richard Hovannisian, Christopher Walker, and Manuk Solmakyan, has concurred that this is what happened, with the exception of only a handful of authors who express doubts that such a meeting took place and dispute that the CUP actually proposed that the ARF foment a rebellion in the Russian Empire during the coming war. These particular authors, including Justin McCarthy, Kamaran Gurun, Salahi Sonyel, and Gunter Louis, all deny that the Ottomans would commit genocide beginning in 1915. The existence of such a meeting between the CUP and the ARF would weaken their contention that the ARF was planning and would execute a rebellion behind Ottoman lines during World War I, as it would raise the question as to what were these two parties negotiating about for 3 days. Yet none of those authors provide any source to support their denial that the CUP was actually trying to recruit the ARF. An analysis of their arguments and sources does show that each of them bases his position on the work of Esat Uras, who Marc mentioned earlier. This is problematic for a number of reasons. First, Uras's book has long been criticized for the way it misrepresents and exaggerates Armenian revolutionary activism, and Uras himself had been intimately involved in the machinery of destruction in 1915 as a senior official in the Ottoman Ministry of the Interior. After the war, he was arrested and charged with murder, but was released when he turned over to the British documents, including the proceedings of the CUP conference that decided to implement the genocide. In the Republic of Turkey, he became a member of parliament for decades and an active member of the Turkish Historical Society. From those positions, he was able to write his book, creating the template for Turkish genocide denial while erasing his own role in the genocide. Secondly, his book is hardly a reliable source on this topic or on ARF decision-making on its stance in the case of war. The relevant sections of this book include a translation of much of an article by ARF Member of Parliament Vahan Papazian in the journal Vem, which includes critical mistranslations and, although it's extremely lengthy, omits numerous passages that contradict his thesis. So for instance, Uras writes that, quote, there are no records or documents to prove these claims, unquote, of an ARF-CUP meeting. Yet he neglects to inform his readers that the disappearance at the end of the war and I'll put disappearance in quotes, of all the papers of the CUP, somehow they disappeared, would require a reliance on non-Turkish sources. McCarthy writes that Uras asserted that the only source for the offer appeared in a Tashnag book printed in Istanbul in 1920 during the period of Allied occupation, and thus was unreliable propaganda. So, it couldn't be an accurate book. However, this claim that that was the only source ignores 5 other accounts by Armenian sources, published here in the US or in Europe, that were available to Uras and to McCarthy, including an article in that same journal Vem that was published 5 issues before the one that Uras translates. So somehow we managed to translate 1,800 words, 30 pages of an article, and yet had he gone back 5 issues earlier, that same journal, he would have found something that talked exactly about what he claimed never existed, this meeting. Even more egregiously, both authors overlook perhaps the best-known publication of the period about the Armenians, the treatment of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, published by the British Parliament, that describes the CUP offer to the ARF in Erzurum. But as a result of Uras's faulty scholarship and the failure of his successors to do even a cursory examination of all the available sources, there is a manufactured controversy about this meeting. So then we hear, because of this, we hear McCarthy write the following. It has been argued that the CUP members went to the Congress to offer the Tashnags autonomy in eastern Anatolia if the Tashnags in the Ottoman and Russian empires would take part in a war against the Russians, which the Tashnags refused. There is no real evidence for this assertion, which is based on Armenian sources, but it is not impossible. No. Now, at least he's claiming that, okay, yeah, there are Armenian sources, but it's not impossible. It could have happened, but I see no proof. And Sonyal, writes pretty much the same thing. Yet, had Uras, Sonyal, or McCarthy examined the Armenian sources, they would have found that a number of the attendees of the World Congress had actually remained in Erzurum after it adjourned, including ARF delegates Simon Varatsian, Rupen Derminasyan, and a guest who was invited to the Congress, the Armenian social revolutionary Vahan Minakhoryan. Each of them wrote books about this. In their publications, Varatsian and Minakhoryan describe a meeting that took place one evening at the Sanasaryan College in Erzurum. The 3 ARF negotiators, Rostom, Agnuni, and Varamyan, met with these 3 World Congress attendees, and Varamyan informed them of the details of their negotiations with the CUP representatives. So here we have, while they're negotiating, during one of the 3 days, that evening they're actually meeting and they're reporting, hey, this is what we've been talking about so far. He told them that it was evident that the CUP was convinced that Germany would be victorious, and thus, for them, any discussion about the Ottoman Empire remaining neutral in the war was pointless. Varatsian, Minakhoryan, and Derminasyan all published accounts of the ARF-CUP negotiations, including the proposal that the ARF foment rebellion in Russia. According to their accounts, the ARF representatives stated that they were adamantly against Turkish entanglement in the war because they believed that it would mean the end of the Ottoman Empire in case of Allied victory, which they believed was likely. They tried to demonstrate that it was in Ottoman interest to remain neutral. The ARF representatives emerged from the negotiations convinced that their party should not alter their stance determined at the World Congress, that during the wartime there should be no rebellion among Ottoman Armenians, and all Armenians must do their duty as Ottoman citizens. So they said they'd stick with the decision, and here we actually have more than one published account that was available to all these. Now, if they had some different account from Behadin Shakir, you could say, okay, these sources say this, these sources say that. There are absolutely no accounts from the other side. The only accounts are happening at the time. They're described afterwards. But yet the fact that the meeting even took place is questioned by Stanford Shaw, by Gunter Louis, by Yusuf Halajoglu, all these scholars, I use the term loosely, but they can't use Turkish sources, so what do they use to claim? Halajoglu quotes a book by Joseph Grable, a Protestant missionary, and he takes some quotes in there and says, oh, well, this is what he wrote. But he very selectively uses it because he in fact omits a statement from the same book, just 2 pages after the one he's quoting, that says the Tashnaq shouldn't demurred from this offer, but promised to advise Ottoman Armenians to carry out their citizenship obligations. So here, even the sources they do find, non-Armenian, non-Turkish sources, they only selectively quote because the same source actually tells the truth, and which is inconvenient for them. It is significant that, contrary to the denialist historiography, a Turkish source confirming an ARF-CUP meeting in Erzurum has actually been found in the post-war trial transcripts by Taner Akçay. These transcripts show that the CUP members were sent to meet with the ARF, but, quote, the Congress appears to have been simply a means to disguise the true purpose for traveling to Erzurum, unquote. That purpose was to form irregular units of the special organization, which we know was the group that would implement most of the genocide. Shakir, of course, Berdin Shakir was the chief of the political bureau of the special organization, and a subsequent installation of the transcripts indicates that Shakir wanted the ARF members who were leaving Erzurum at the conclusion of the World Congress to be apprehended on the way and liquidated.
Wow.
And he later complains that, oh, well, somehow they slipped through our grasp. So despite the clumsy attempts to sow doubt described earlier in this article, it is clear that multiple published Armenian sources and the British Parliament's Blue Book all present roughly the same account of the meetings between the ARF and CUP negotiators at Erzurum in the days before World War I. Now, the drawback of these sources is that the authors were not participants in the actual talks. I mean, they heard about it a few hours later, and that the ARF negotiators who were actually there never wrote memoirs because 2 would actually be killed in the genocide and the 3rd would die in 1919. However, the ARF archives do contain a report to the ARF Western Bureau on the proceedings by one of these 3 negotiators, Varamyan. His account is consistent with, yet much more detailed than the published accounts. Thus, we have a first-person, contemporaneous account of the ARF-CUP meetings and negotiations in Erzurum. I won't get into the details of it, I've actually covered in some detail in my book, but we know page after page, we know specifically what the debates were, what the proposals were back and forth between the CUP and the ARF, and we have it from somebody who was writing at the time in a secret report back to his own headquarters in Geneva. So it's very clear what was, the evidence is clearly overwhelming. What is clear then from the documentary record is that the CUP unsuccessfully attempted to recruit the ARF to organize Russian Armenians to form a 5th column behind Russian lines once the war began. A number of the authors mentioned above deny or diminish this fact because it undermines their contention that the deportation of the Armenian population was justified, because the ARF had organized Ottoman Armenians to form a 5th column behind Ottoman lines once the war began. So, on this one, I think it's pretty much a slam dunk case. There's very little evidence saying otherwise, and there's overwhelming evidence showing this meeting took place, and the only discussion was, will you, the ARF, do a 5th column for us? They said, no, we're gonna have Ottoman Armenians join their army, Russian Armenians join the other army. But now, I want to cover the second major issue that comes up here, is even that's not enough for these deniers, because now they're going to take on the issue of the Armenians who actually did fight with the Russians, who were mostly Russian Armenians, and how the issue of the Armenian volunteer units is going to be morphed in their debates into a 5th column again. So Vahan Papazian again wrote in the same journal Vem that in Constantinople, Talat expressed his disappointment in the ARF stance to Armengaro Pastirmajan, in what they heard in Erzurum, and added that the CUP would draw its own conclusions from that. The Constantinople section of the ARF Armenia Bureau called a consultative meeting to determine what position should the party take. So they had a provisional thing. Now we're going to have another meeting, say, okay, we've met with the CUP, what are we going to do? Since the World Congress was unable to. There were 2 opposing viewpoints at this meeting as to what would be the result of the hostilities that were about to break out between the Ottomans and the Russians. The minority opinion was that the Russian army would strike a lightning blow and easily advance into Ottoman territory. In that case, Russian Armenian volunteer units would have to be ready to act as an advance guard to protect Armenian population centers from Turkish or Kurdish retaliation. Thus, the Armenians would have to negotiate with the Russian government and get their agreement on Armenian political demands before the war started. Now, when Uras published his translation of Papazian's this article, however, he omits 3 consecutive paragraphs within these pages that I'm now quoting. Even though he's quoted the whole rest verbatim, suddenly 3 paragraphs disappear. Among these omissions are Papazian's observation that the consultative meeting was convinced that the Ottomans were inviting destruction by joining the war, and Krikor Zorab, who was invited to the meeting, his belief that they would take revenge on the Armenians once they entered the war.
Well,
Also omitted from another paragraph that was omitted, is the meeting's belief that, quote, while we were obliged to join the Turkish army, not just as soldiers, the Turks would undoubtedly demand from us that we neutralize operations of the Russian Armenian soldiers and irregulars, and would even expect extraordinary services, about which they'd already spoken in Erzurum, unquote. So thus, you actually have here, what is he taking out? Again, the description of the meeting and the fact that the fears of this meeting, saying, well, this is what's likely going to happen because we said no to them in Erzurum. But somehow that disappeared when Uras was translating this article by Papazian. Now, the majority opinion at this consultative meeting of the ARF was more pessimistic of the chances of a rapid Russian advance, given that the Russian commanders in the Caucasus were weak and that they would need large numbers of troops on other fronts. In the majority opinion, the dangers for the Ottoman Armenian population were inescapable. Although the order for self-defense had to be given, it was also essential to assemble some large Armenian irregular units at a few points near the borders in the Caucasus. They should remain in reserve and only cross the border in extreme circumstance, such as a massacre of the Armenian population or the complete defeat of Ottoman forces. These two opposing positions, minority and majority, remained irreconcilable, and so it was decided to submit both of them to an examination of the ARF Central Committees and the Eastern Bureau of the ARF in Tiflis. However, despite the disagreement on that, all in the meeting were in agreement that Ottoman Armenians had to honestly undertake their responsibilities as citizens and undertake the sacrifices demanded of them, including enlistment in the army and payment of special war taxes. This final sentence is perhaps the most critical of the passages that Esat Uras omits. It shows that although there were 2 positions about whether or not to keep Armenian volunteers in reserve in Russia or put them under Russian command, all were agreed that Ottoman Armenians must not revolt but should join the Ottoman army. But somehow when you translate this huge article, you have to make some edits, and somehow this important stuff gets left out. Not only do Uras's omissions greatly distort Papazian's description of the deliberations of the consultative meeting, his translation at one point is diametrically opposed to a literal translation of the Armenian. So Uras writes, quote, the Armenian bands would have to serve under the command of the Russian army. This formal link would have certain advantages, unquote. Pretty clear, right? However, Papazian's actual text reads, quote, they thought it would be detrimental to organize any kind of volunteer units and then thereby completely subordinate themselves to the Russian army, unquote. The exact opposite of what the Armenian says is what comes out in Uras's translation. In addition, in multiple places where Papazian writes about a debate about the formation of Gamavor Kunter, literally volunteer regiments, Gamavor Kunter, Uras translates this not into volunteer regiments, but into guerrilla bands. Think about the difference. Volunteer regiments, guerrilla bands. This allows Uras and consequently McCarthy, Gurun, and Louis to portray the ARF as planning an uprising by Ottoman Armenians rather than an Armenian volunteer movement in the Russian army. And this is what's happening and this is the source that's a major portion of Uras's book. Let's go back to what Papazian actually did and what he actually writes. He personally conveyed to the ARF leadership in Tiflis the concerns and opinions expressed in the Constantinople consultative meeting. However, there was already such enthusiasm among Russian Armenians to quickly join the fighting by forming volunteer regiments, in part to have forces to protect the Armenian population from the Turks, that the Eastern Bureau rejected the idea of keeping their forces in reserve. they decided to proceed with the organization of volunteer regiments to serve under Russian arms. This decision was taken in full knowledge that the result could actually be fratricidal warfare between Armenians serving with the Ottoman and Russian armies. So they decided, yeah, we're gonna have Armenians fight in both, and brothers might be shooting brothers, but because because politically it's the only thing you can do, that's what they decided to do. Despite having quoted to this point a 1,400-word translation, Uras now summarizes in one paragraph the next 3 pages of Papazian's article. I guess he ran out of room. So now he's going to summarize. So then he says, Papazian tells us that he personally took these views to the Caucasian Center, and at the end of the discussions held in Tiflis, the first view won. So far, that's accurate. But, he says, it was as a result of these discussions that the Tashnakchun that it was a result of these discussions. Oh, excuse me, hold on. Oh. Let me go on. Uras claims that, quote, Papazian's article reveals that revolts, enlistment in the Russian army, the formation of volunteer bands, and attacks on Ottoman troops did not come about as a reaction to forced relocation, deportations, but that relocation took place because of them, unquote. So, I told you what Papazian actually wrote, and this is what his conclusion is. Oh, I don't need to directly quote the next 3 pages. I'll give you a nice 2 sentences. It's clear they were starting revolt, and that's why they were deported. This is a clear distortion of Papazian's article. While Papazian does write about enlistment in the Russian army and the formation of volunteer regiments, there is no discussion of revolts or attacks on our Ottoman troops anywhere in the article, except as part of being part of the Russian army. So, I mean, again, you take 3 pages, you summarize it, and suddenly, instead of it being a word-for-word translation, this is what you get. Even more significantly, if we actually look at what Uras is claiming that Papazian said, the Eastern Bureau in Tiflis had no jurisdiction over ARF activities within the Ottoman Empire. As I stated, the only question that they were sending from Constantinople there was, how are we going to organize our Armenian volunteers? In the Russian army or in reserve at the border? And that would, of course, because it's on the Russian side of the border, that is the Eastern Bureau's decision to make. When it comes to the other side of the border, they have absolutely no jurisdiction, because the Seventh World Congress in 1913 had created a separate Armenia Bureau, which governed all ARF bodies within the Armenian provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and the Eastern Bureau's jurisdiction ended at the border. So even if everything else Uras said was true, suppose that was the decision made, it would be irrelevant, anything that was said in Tiflis, because they didn't have the authority to even make that decision. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, again, that part of it is completely bogus. Uras's omissions and distortions carry over to the recent denialist literature on this subject as well. All in various forms repeat Uras's contention that the ARF initiated guerrilla attacks and revolts that predated any deportations, and imply or state that any massacres that may have taken place were in response to Armenian violence. But while Uras provides the template for this line of argument, the sources cited by more recent authors are Ottoman intelligence reports and a speech by Hovannisian. We actually see this when we see Justin McCarthy write the following. What is certain is that the Tashnak Congress did resolve that Ottoman Armenians would do their patriotic duty. Thank you, Justin, you gave us something. This was a subterfuge, as Ottoman intelligence reports and the statement of prominent Tashnak leader Hovannisian, Prime Minister of the Armenian Republic, attested. The actual Tashnak plan, directed by the party in the Russian Empire, was to ally themselves with the Russians. So, 2 sources for this. An Ottoman intelligence report and Kachasnuni. This Ottoman intelligence report, we actually hear quite a bit about Ottoman intelligence reports. We hear about it from Gunter Louis, we hear about it from McCarthy, we hear about it from Sonyel, we hear about it from Mim Kemal Oke. And each time they write about it, it always sounds like it's a different report. It's always a different source, you know, it's described differently, it's coming from a different place, or it appeared in the paper. But if you actually go back and look at it, it's all one report. So there's one Ottoman army report that basically is being used by all of them. But we can conclude that a single Ottoman military intelligence report may be the only source for all 4 authors. But when we examine the report itself, we find no reference to dual resolutions, one of them a subterfuge adopted by the World Congress, as McCarthy claims. It doesn't show up in the intelligence report at all. As to McCarthy's claim that Kachaznouni confirms that the ARF planned to have Ottoman Armenians form guerrilla bands and have Armenian soldiers desert the Ottoman army and join the Russians, a plain text reading of both the English translation and the original Armenian edition clearly shows that Kachaznouni makes no reference at all to Ottoman Armenians doing or not doing their duty as Ottoman citizens. He doesn't even talk about it. So how they could draw that conclusion is for us to figure out. Kachaznouni only discusses the organization of the volunteer regiments in the Russian army and states that it is useless to speculate whether the savage persecutions of the Armenians would not have taken place, quote, if we had adopted a different course on this side of the border, unquote. So Kachaznouni can't be the source for this claim either. In fact, Kachaznouni's speech is presented as a smoking gun by a number of denialist authors because not only do they finally have an Armenian source, but one that was an ARF leader, and we know what they think of the ARF, and Prime Minister of the Republic of Armenia from July 1918 to August 1919. Thus, Michael Gunter boasts that, quote, Kachaznouni's statement constitutes a remarkable self-criticism of the Armenians by one of their top leaders. No wonder many Armenians have done their best to remove this telling document from libraries around the world, and that due to his position he was an authority well placed to judge what had just occurred during the war, unquote. So there it is, there's a smoking gun. But let's look at what Kachaznouni actually writes in his speech with the claim, and compare that to the claims that are drawn from it. In some cases, the English translation of the speech is quoted accurately and at length, but with conclusions drawn from it that do not appear anywhere in his text. Michael Gunter, in the book that Marc showed you earlier, reprints over 1,000 words of the speech, quoted and translated into English, and he is correct that it is a remarkable self-criticism. However, he fabricates from whole cloth when then he writes, quote, as the testimony of Hovhannes Kachaznouni, the first Prime Minister of Armenia after World War I, makes clear, some Armenians killed as many Turks as they could in a misguided attempt to strike for independence, unquote. There it is, damning proof. But nowhere in the 1,000 words that he quotes, and nowhere in the 8 pages of the Armenian original where Kachaznouni covers what happened during the World War, is there any mention of Armenians killing Turks. Doesn't come up, not once. Nor is there any allusion of any kind to Armenian massacres of civilians, which Gunter, of course, insinuates in his quote. So much for that smoking gun. Now, that dismisses that. Now, Uras and other denialist authors do have a valid point. Not everything they say is completely bogus. The valid point they have concerns the role played by Armengado Pastirmajan as commander of one of the volunteer regiments that served with the Russian army. To have such a high-profile ARF member and former Ottoman deputy cross the border could legitimately be seen by the CUP as a betrayal. But the action of one individual cannot be generalized to an entire party, much less to an entire people, as these authors like to do. This is especially the case when one considers the large number of ARF leadership figures who remained in the Ottoman Empire and were consequently murdered by their former allies in the CUP. Unfortunately, this kernel of truth regarding an individual, Armengado, is exaggerated into a mass movement. Yusuf Guklu claims that, quote, he went over to the Russian side with almost all the Armenian soldiers in the Ottoman Third Army in eastern Anatolia at the outbreak of the war and returned at its head, unquote. There it is. Okay, maybe it was Armengado. He took all the Armenian soldiers of the Third Army. Again, no evidence for this. In fact, in direct contradiction to this, at the Battle of Sarıkamış, Armenian soldiers of the Third Army, same army, had distinguished themselves in combat. This fact was broadcast by no less an authority than the de facto commander-in-chief of Ottoman armed forces and Minister of War, Enver Pasha. So supposedly, when the war broke out, Armengado takes all the Armenians and all their guns out of the Ottoman Third Army, crosses the border, and to join the Russians. And yet here's Enver Pasha after the first battle of the war, where the disaster where he attacked the Russians, saying well, despite everything else, the Armenian soldiers actually fought very well for me. All right, so I guess maybe Guplu is saying that Enver is a liar. Who knows? And this comes up repeatedly. This idea of this mass movement of Armenians leaving the Ottoman Empire. Some of McCarthy's sources speak of Armenian young men fleeing to avoid conscription, but none of them provide any evidence of them leaving their ranks en masse with their weapons. So it's one thing to say Armenians were leaving the Ottoman Empire. Armenians were trying to avoid the draft. We've never heard that happening, right? You know, people avoid the draft, it happened. That would be one thing, but if they're taking their weapons, they join the army, they take their weapons and they go and join the other side, that's something quite different, yet there's no evidence of this. In fact, the only source that Justin McCarthy, when he writes about this, he says, the Russian consul writes about this. And he quotes in his book, the Russian consul. Okay, that's a pretty good source, right? Only one problem. The Russian consul report, he says, talking about this, is from February of 1913. But he's got an explanation for that. Don't worry, he's got it covered. He's got this discrepancy covered. He writes in the endnotes, the Russian consul in Van had already foretold in 1913 that Armenian soldiers would join the Armenian rebels and Russia would intervene, unquote. So, there's your evidence. I mean, most historians don't qualify soothsaying or predictions as evidence, but in this case, I guess it's okay. Let me give one last example before I wrap up. This distortion of published sources doesn't end with Kachasnuni. In fact, Justin McCarthy, in his book about Van, titles a whole section, Political Preparations for Armenian Rebellion. And he starts what sounds like, again, another persuasive argument. Let me read it to you. Armenian nationalists saw the war as an opportunity to revolt. As Louise Nalbantian, the historian of the Armenian revolutionary movement, has written, the most opportune time for the revolutionaries to institute the general rebellion for carrying out the immediate objective was when Turkey was engaged in a war. There it is, right? Well, a few problems here too. When you actually look at Nalbantian's book, you find a number of problems. First, he uses brackets to talk about the revolutionaries. And in the prior sentence, Armenian nationalists is who he's talking about. And they're the ones who fomented the rebellion. But this distorts Nalbantian because Nalbantian, when she's being quoted here, is actually quoting a part of the program of the Hanchagyan Revolutionary Party. So if it's part of the Hanchagyan platform, it doesn't apply to the ARF or any of the other Armenian nationalists who McCarthy wants to indict. And secondly, it's not even clear that this is applicable to even the Hanchagyans, because guess when this particular thing was written? At the founding of the Hanchagyan Party in 1887. So again, here we are, we're dealing with soothsaying, we're dealing with fortune telling. In 1887, the Hanchagyan said this, so therefore in 1915 the ARF did it. McCarthy clearly implies that this plan to rebel during wartime was a current one and not 28 years old. And in fact, it's hard to even say this applies to the Hanchagyan Party because the Hanchagyan Party between 1887 and 1915 has already split once and been reformed 3 other times. It doesn't even have the same name, and the Hanchagyan Party that existed in 1914, the Social Democratic Hanchagyan Party, would have been incapable of organizing any kind of revolt because almost their entire leadership was arrested in 1914 before the war even began. So much for that. Okay, let me wrap up. When we examine the internal deliberations and party decisions of the ARF in the summer and fall of 1914, we find no evidence of a conspiracy with Russia to create a 5th column behind Ottoman lines. Rather, we find a party desperately trying to convince its former allies in the CUP not to enter the war in alliance with Germany because it would be disastrous for both the Ottoman Empire and for its Armenian citizens. The ARF 8th World Congress resolved that the Ottoman Armenians and Russian Armenians should do their duty and serve in the army of their respective empires, although this would mean that they could be firing on their own compatriots. In fact, the only proposal regarding a 5th column that the party received was the CUP proposal that the ARF foment internal rebellion behind Russian lines at a critical juncture in the coming war. A number of authors claim that the World Congress passed a resolution calling for guerrilla war behind Ottoman lines, but an examination of their sourcing show that all are derived from a single Ottoman military intelligence report, which is contradicted by the actual resolutions themselves. When we examine the sources cited by the authors who claim an Armenian rebellion, we repeatedly find manipulations of the original sources and a heavy reliance on the work of Esat Uras. Armenian and non-Armenian sources cited often have key passages omitted because they contradict the denialist case. Uras's book itself is replete with mistranslations and distortions, as well as key omissions. Most prominently, Hovhannes Kachasnuni's speech denouncing the ARF is often cited because of his formerly prominent position in the party. But in this case as well, the denier's case must be made by inserting claims of Armenian massacres of civilians, organization of revolts, and guerrilla attacks that appear nowhere in his text. We may conclude that, as in other cases of genocide denial, the evidence does not support any of the voluminous publications. Thank you.
When you talk about the tobacco industry, obviously the consequences of denial, and the stakes are higher, right? It's a matter of life and death. In the case of the Armenian genocide, I'd like you to address something that I think we've discussed before, and I think is important to you personally as well. The whole issue of what were the consequences of denial in the context of the United States, which is what your presentation mainly deals with. And my question to Dikran is, another point that came to my mind when you talked about Kaligian Bastırmacı is the fact that his own brother was actually fighting on the Ottoman side, and there's a couple of papers I think written about this. So I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah, thanks. It's hard to quantify precisely what the consequences are, but certainly, among them are the fact that to the extent that people in the United States have any knowledge about the Armenian genocide, as I said, the controversy part of it is perhaps the predominant one. They know, yeah, something happened, yeah, there's this debate going on and there's two sides and it's unresolved. I'm sure that fact, or would-be fact, has stuck in the minds of many people. It certainly helped to forestall official recognition, I think, because the justification that, well, the scholars are still debating this is a very easy one for politicians to hide behind. They say, well, look, I'm not a historian. This is a matter that needs to be settled among scholars, and the scholars clearly don't agree on this because, as we can see, there are lengthy and voluminous publications on both sides of the issue. And in general, again, I think the fact of a controversy or the allegation of a controversy becomes inseparable from any discussion of the issue. So that any time the issue comes up in an American context or elsewhere, you have to deal with the controversy part. It's like fighting your way through the reeds to get to the river, except you never get to the river sometimes.
Thank you, Patrick, for pointing that out. I think the point you bring up about Armin Gatto and his brother just shows just how gut-wrenching the decision was that the ARF was making here. I mean, it's very clear when you actually look at their documents. They saw themselves in a no-win situation. Their only chance they had to avoid having Armenians shooting at Armenians was to keep the Ottomans out of the war, which is what they tried to do. They tried to convince the CUP, hey, you're headed for a disaster. You're going to destroy your own empire. Never mind about us, you're destroying yourselves. Once it became clear that they were joining the Germans, there was no good decision, no good solution. All you could do was pick the least bad solution. And the least bad meant was, look, we're each going to have to join the war, even if we don't believe in the Ottomans, even if they've treated us badly. We can't give them the excuse to wipe out the Armenians by starting a rebellion or by not joining the Ottoman army. So all the Ottoman Armenians have to join the Ottoman army. And there's been a lot of criticism, in fact, in years sense of the ARF for even making that decision because, hey, look, you let all those Armenian boys get killed when they joined the Armenian Ottoman army and they got massacred. But it was the least bad decision available. They had each side, they had Russian Armenians join the Russian army, Ottoman Armenians join the Ottoman army, and who knows how many times they ended up shooting at each other. But that was the least bad decision that was available.
Yes, sir.
I want to make a comment about, I think, the strategy for how to deal with the genocide deniers. In the internet age, everything is different. And I think that people who do things that are fraudulent and academically unsound, if you highlight that and if you publicize that, they probably in their worlds, you know, in their worlds of Turkish studies, they're known, but in the larger academic context, they're not known for being fraudulent scholars or genocide denialists. Maybe what NAASR should consider doing is setting up a website called Genocide Denialists, and each academic should get their own page that puts their picture up there, states the fraudulent work that they're doing, and leaves that out there for their university communities when they're up for promotions, when they're up for tenure, when they're up for jumping to other jobs, that this is out there so that when a search is done, that there's a broader context of who they are, and maybe even some additional research could be done as to what are their funding sources. Now, I could be wrong. Do universities keep records of what grants each scholar gets? Don't those have to be reported?
I suppose that they probably do. I don't know if they have to be by law, but I imagine that they are.
I think in academia, that if you get a grant for a particular
Yes.
thing, that's something that's reported to the university. So all it takes is a little bit of research to draw the line to the money for what's being done by who's suing, who's putting this out there, and where's the funding source for that. And if you bring the light of day to that, it's going to raise the cost to the genocide deniers who really don't pay a significant cost at this point. But there are examples in current times of quote controversial issues where when you bring the light to the people who are doing uncouth things, it makes a lot of people say, whoa, there's a cost, we can't do this anymore.
I think you raise an important point here. I think there has been a lack of the kind of digging that you point to here. And the reasons for this, I suppose, are numerous. One is that I think my only disagreement with you is that I think you're underestimating the difficulty or the complexity of doing this. It's without access to the kind of documents that, as I said, we have access to for the tobacco industry, where there are millions of searchable documents online, and you can say, oh, this is exactly what happened, and this is where the money came from. In the case of let's call it denial, as we're discussing it tonight, we have, I suppose, a single document that was accidentally put in an envelope and mailed to Robert J. Lifton. One. The rest is inference, or drawing conclusions based on evidence. That's what inference means. Two. Not only is it expensive and time-consuming, there is the risk of legal actions.
Certain.
We have seen,
Not a risk.
yeah, the certainty, as Dikran says, that such efforts will be countered in courts. And there is not, whereas there is a Turkish-American Legal Defense Fund that is a sub-entity of the Turkish Coalition of America, and which therefore has substantial resources to draw upon. There is no equivalent entity in the Armenian world. There is the Armenian Bar Association, which does noble and good work, but it does not have a war chest of millions of dollars to help fight off these kinds of lawsuits, which can destroy people's careers. And then the last risk is that such work has to be done very carefully, also because you don't want to draw attention to such work and present it in such a way. It has to be, denial, as Dikran has demonstrated tonight, has to be exposed in minute detail if it's going to be done properly, because you have to go into each document and break it down. But I think your main point of following the money is an important one. But keep in mind too that it's not illegal for a scholar to get money from a Turkish-American group. It's perfectly legal.
Well, let me just add to that. I mean, it is necessary to be done. The problem is the Turks also know, and their organizations also know, that this is a dangerous problem for their academics that are serving them. So, for instance, there was a report put out by the Southern Poverty Law Center talking specifically about corruption of academia by Turkish government money, and it talked about money going from Turkey to Gunter Louis to publish his particular book. You know what happened to the Southern Poverty Law Center? They were sued by the Turkish American Legal Defense Fund. And again, when you have a $30 million pot of money to start with, the way you want to intimidate anyone who considers doing something like that. And unfortunately, the Southern Poverty Law Center got weak knees and buckled. And they actually withdrew the report, even though there was nothing inaccurate about the report. But just the fact they would have to spend hundreds of thousands, if not more dollars, to defend that, they suddenly backed off. So your point is well made, and the research has to be done, but anyone who is going to publish that, anyone who's going to put it out there publicly, is going to get sued and has to be ready to be able to fight that back. And that's another weapon used by the Turkish denial machine to say, University of Minnesota, you dare say anything about these unreliable sources, you're getting sued. And it doesn't matter if you win the lawsuit, how much money did they have to spend to defend it? Do you think the next university is going to publish the same type of thing? Or, because wouldn't that be better than NAASR publishing this to actually have a university publish it? But I don't know if any university is going to look, the first in their legal department is going to say, oh, you better look at what happened at the University of Minnesota. So I agree with you, it has to be done, but it has to be done carefully, and it has to be done with the expectation, from now on, anytime you do anything like that, you're going to get sued. And you have to be ready to fight back.
George?
Just one thing, I think you're underestimating the fact that all of the denial has been refuted anyways academically. It doesn't matter when power is behind the denial and money is behind the denial. Anything you come up with is not going to stop the denial. Anything you can envision has been done with the Holocaust. There is still denial, the most documented possibly event in history. So just get used to the fact that there's going to be denial. Even if the Turkish government acknowledges the genocide, there will be denial. There will be denialists out there. So get used to that. The argument is, this is genocide, and this is what happened, and they're not the same. But what they're defining as genocide isn't the definition of genocide. What they're describing as genocide is not the genocide. Or do you agree, I guess, that even these books, the way they're being written and the events as they're describing them, even under the Turkish version, official Turkish government's version, that it constitutes genocide, and maybe that approach is a different way of handling these?
Yes, and one of the only things I've read that takes such a tack was there was a report or an article or an opinion, however you want to discuss it, that came out a couple of years ago by a very prominent English jurist, Jeffrey Robertson, and entitled, "Was There an Armenian Genocide?" And the answer is no. It's not what it sounds like. The answer is yeah, stupid. And what it does is it essentially does what you just said, George. It takes the denier's arguments in some cases and says, even allowing this to be the case, it is clear that ... because the definition of genocide is ... Yes, many of these works redefine genocide to be anything other than, anything other than what happened to the Armenians. In other words, if anybody rose up in self-defense, it wasn't a genocide. If there was a war going on, there wasn't a genocide. If there was conflict in the community, there's no... Anyway, you get the idea. If there were any left at the end of the war, as Mr. Erdogan has just explained to us recently, that of course there couldn't have been a genocide because there are Armenians living in Turkey still today who are descendants of Armenians who lived in Turkey then.
Or
QED.
if part of the plan wasn't to exterminate every Armenian everywhere on the planet, then it's not, I mean, these are all pseudo-arguments that change the definition of genocide. So you're right, part of the argument has to be taking their own argument and say, even under these circumstances, it's genocide. And maybe we don't do that enough, but the thing that comes down to it is, they don't care. It still works for them because even by making you go through that, they're putting enough doubt in the mind. See, wait a minute, they're having to redefine genocide just to make their case. It puts the doubts in people's mind. But you're right, that can be part of the argumentation. That can be part of the debate as well, part of the refutation.
Leva?
Yeah, well, as you know, I'm also working in this area of denial. And one of the things that I've noticed in looking at this denialist literature is that Armenians are held to a standard of absolute perfection. So if you can find one Armenian soldier who defected and took up arms for the Russians, or there was some Armenian killed a Turk to escape, that's used as evidence of rebellion. Therefore, it's not a genocide.
Indeed.
So this absolute perfection standard runs through all of this denialist literature.
Very good point.
Larry?
Thank you for the interesting informative lecture. My question is about the, as you mentioned, Mark, in the beginning of your lecture, the denial started during the genocide. Like, I believe it started even before, like they prepared the solid ground for the implementation of the genocide. And what do you think, what are the main fears or motives of the Turkish state implemented genocide, because genocide denial? Because in comparison with the Holocaust denial, the Armenian genocide denial is implemented by the state, and it grows rapidly, day by day, with new methods, new forms. What do you think, what are the main motives, reasons, fears? And my next question is, we are approaching to the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. So some scholars who seem to acknowledge the Armenian Genocide, they say, okay, if you need the apology, you will get the apology. You will say, yes, it was genocide, so we apologize, people apologize. But what should be our steps? Like, what do we want in our struggle in this field? Do we ask for reparation, or do we have plans? What should we do after?
I'm glad you don't have any difficult questions. I'll let Dikran take.
Actually, your second question in some ways answers the first question. Because that's precisely it. Coming up to the 100, is acknowledgement going to be enough? Oh, well, you know, you're right. There have been many academics who've been hinting something's going to happen in 2015. You know, there'll be something. Will it be the genocide word? Maybe, maybe not. But Turkey's going to say something, and I tend to agree with them. The question is that enough? And that gets to your first question. The first question is, why is Turkey doing this, and for so long, and continuing? And part of it is psychological. Having to tell your own people you've been lying for 100 years is going to be a tough thing to do. But that's not the real motivation. The real motivation is, what is the next step? Is it just saying, I did it? Because if that's it, I said 15 years ago, if Turkey ever gets to the point they realize they can say, yes, we did the genocide, and not have to pay any consequences, not with reparations, not with money, not with property, not with land, they'll do it tomorrow. So that's the fear. The fear is Germany did not just say, yes, we committed the Holocaust. They paid reparations. They had to pay substantial money, not just to the families, not just for properties lost, but also directly to Israel as the new homeland for the Jewish people. That, in an Armenian case, is going to even be more direct. And because of that, that's why a major part of the fight against Turkish genocide denial is not just to make it about, did it happen or didn't happen, is it genocide or isn't it genocide? Because as we all know, you commit murder, I shoot poor Miles here in the front row, I can't deny, if I deny it for 20 years, sorry Miles, and say I didn't do it, and then 20 years later I go to the judge, yes I did it, I'm sorry, do I get to go home? No. There's got to be justice, right? What happens to me? I go to jail, right?
Or something.
That's justice, that's consequences, right? So it's not, so when you're talking about 1.5 million people, and you're talking about denying it for 100 years, they can't just 100 years later come back and say, yeah, sorry, we lied about it. There's got to be consequences if it's going to be justice, and making sure that the Turkish government can't separate these two is the key to fighting denial and to fighting for justice for the Armenian genocide. Don't let them separate the issue of whether it happened, whether it constituted genocide, from the consequences, the reparations, the return of properties and lands that it entails.
I agree with almost all of that, except that I'm not personally convinced that even if there were guaranteed that there would be no reparations or restitution, I'm still not sure there would be a full, frank, and genuine acknowledgement, because there's so much to undo, as you say, in terms of when you create a lying narrative for 100 years, not only in your country, but which you try to impose abroad. That's a huge thing to own up to and to undo. And one might add also, to keep up with current events, that's an element that was entirely missing from Mr. Erdogan's expression of condolences recently. There's no mention of the constant big fat elephant in the room, that of denial, and the Turkish government's support for it at home and abroad. Pam.
I was going to ask the same question as my first question, which is really what is behind the denial. But now, but my second question is this: what is most important to both of you? For example, an important one, because you've just given wonderful talks, about having denial shown up for what it is, and having there be a change, presumably, even though you say it's Marc, that it's totally unlikely for the reasons you just gave. Still, this is your life, in good part. And Dikran as well has spent tremendous effort and time on this. So what's most important to you and to Armenians as you see it?
To Armenians as I see it. Well, let's stick with me. Enough about Armenians, let's talk about me. The main thing that matters to me is truth. It's just that simple. And it, you can talk about reparations or restitutions or one's ancestors or one's grandmother, all of those things come into it. But it's about the truth and the need for truth in history. Period. And anything less than that sort of sticks in your craw, or my craw. Dikran?
To me, the question first, you want the main reason for it is justice. The Armenians seek justice. And we might all define it slightly differently, but most Armenians agree on a basic level of what that is. So the Armenians seek justice for what happened. But then there's, in getting to that justice, or what that justice will constitute, we actually have to look at what were the consequences of the Armenian genocide. Richard Hovannisian has said, even if the genocide had taken, even if the deportation had taken place, had there not been the actual massacre of 1.5 million, today you would excuse me, let me take that back. Had the genocide taken place, the initial phase, but had the Republic of Armenia not been attacked by Turkey and the Soviet Union afterwards and destroyed as well, today you would have a prosperous Armenia with perhaps 20 million people in it. That's even after the genocide, just by natural growth. What do we have today? We know the situation of Armenia. And in fact, it's often used by Turks and Azeris to say, oh, why are you people arguing about Artsakh? Or why are you arguing about the genocide? You've got this poor, impoverished country, people are leaving it, it can't support itself. Why? Why can't it feed itself? Why isn't it energy self-sufficient? Why does it have insecure borders? Because of the genocide. Because of what Turkey did in World War I. Armenia is still suffering from that, and the current Republic of Armenia cannot support itself, cannot defend itself because of that. And so when we talk about justice, we talk about adding the territories to Armenia that would allow it to be self-sufficient. You add Artsakh and the Ararat Valley, all the Ararat plain, those are the two historical breadbaskets that fed Armenia through history. Artsakh is a separate country right now. The Ararat Plain, half of it is in Turkey. If those were added, Armenia could come very close to feeding itself. You add those extra territories, Armenia could probably be energy self-sufficient. Today, Artsakh, just in its hydroelectric power, is self-sufficient in energy and is exporting that energy to Armenia. You remember what Armenia was like during the blockade, during the post-earthquake days. If you do what Woodrow Wilson said and allow it an outlet to the Black Sea, even though Trebizond didn't even have a majority Armenian population, Wilson said make that part of Armenia. Suddenly Armenia now has a direct route to Europe for trade, for economic development. Unlike the situation today where it's blockaded from two sides and Georgia is an unreliable ally, unreliable border, and the only reliable route is Iran, who as we know is an international pariah. You allow Armenia a direct route to the Black Sea, suddenly it can flourish economically, because the Armenians have history of doing that, and suddenly instead of all these Armenians going to Moscow or going to other parts of the former Soviet Union because they can't make a living in Armenia, suddenly they'll all go back. And now that suddenly your population drain, your brain drain is eliminated as well. So for very practical reasons, Armenia, for its own national security, needs justice for the Armenian genocide, despite the fact that President Sargsyan often doesn't say that. For his own good, for his own country's good, Armenia needs justice for the Armenian genocide. It needs to eliminate an unrepentant genocide denier from its border, because as long as there's that thing, genocide hanging over them, Turkey's going to continue to try to pressure Armenia and attack Armenians like they did in Kesab, 2 months ago, attack the Armenians have the Al-Qaeda group rebels attack the Armenians of Kesab in Syria, because again, that's on Turkey's border, they don't want that. As long as that's the situation, Armenia will never be secure. So justice for the Armenian genocide is not just the wish of us in the diaspora, it's actually for the good of the Armenians and the security of the Armenian state in the future.
And if elected. Linda.
With the Turkish population growing in the United States, about 20-25 years ago, you would hardly hear any Turkish walking down the streets, especially here in Massachusetts. But now, everywhere you go, even in remote areas like Salem, New Hampshire, I hear Turkish in the malls. So with them increasing in numbers in this country, how do you see the future of denialism? Because I'm pretty sure they're going to establish a Turkish lobby. So what are your thoughts on that? And the second question I have, I also kind of see a conspiracy with the Western world to kind of hush-hush Armenia in every single way. Why is it that the Archaeology magazine, the National Geographic, and da-da-da, never really covers about our ancient history? We hear about the Greeks, we hear about the Egyptians, but you would never hear anything about the Armenians. So is there some kind of a bigger conspiracy against us?
Okay, close the doors. Should I reveal it or should you? No.
1915. No, yeah.
Of course, there are a lot of Turks in the world. It's a big country. There's nothing wrong with them coming to this country either, of course. But you're right. There is going to be more Turkish influence domestically with the increase in Turkish American population. They have a lobby. If you ever want a sobering sight, go to the website of the Turkish American Council and look at the corporations that are members of it. It's like, the business of, the General Motors slogan, the business of America is business. The business of these people is America as well. It's, everybody, from military contractors down to you name it. When you have corporate America, you don't really need to hire lobbyists. But of course they have lobbyists too. So yeah, I think the note of concern that you're sounding is completely legitimate, and the Armenian American lobbying groups are in some respects not as organized and as powerful as they were in the past. and they certainly don't draw from the same kind of well of resources. As for the conspiracy, I don't really think so, but I totally know what you're talking about. I hear what you're saying, and I think it's all a function of power. Power. Armenia is small and insignificant, and it doesn't get as much attention as Turkey, which is large and powerful. Rafi's phone going off indicates to me that he has to go home. And the clock tells me that I have to get Miles home so he can go to bed. And I'm sure you all want to go home too. But there are refreshments, and I hope you will stay and enjoy them. And any last words? I thank Dikran for his excellent presentation, and I thank all of you for coming tonight.